Hello, writers. I am so happy to be having a conversation today with Sharon Skinner. Welcome, Sharon.
Thanks for having me.
So I would like to introduce our writers here to Sharon. Sharon holds a BA in English, an MA in creative writing, and is a certified book coach and freelance editor. And she helps writers weave their words into stories that shine. She mainly writes fantasy, science fiction, paranormal, and the occasional steampunk for audiences of all ages. Sharon is an active member of the SCBWI, and she serves as the regional advisor in Arizona. She also served aboard the USS Jason, the first US Navy vessel to take women to sea, which makes Sharon totally awesome in many ways. And we will talk more here about where we can find Sharon, but you can find her at sharonskinner.com to find more of her books, and bookcoachingbySharon.com, which is where she does all of her book coaching and editing stuff. So welcome again, Sharon. And writers, we're gonna talk here a bit about making our words shine. As you heard, Sharon helps writers weave their words into stories that shine. And Sharon just has a lot of great experience with line level writing, which is why I asked her to come and have this conversation with me. So shall we hop right into it?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm excited to talk about this. This is one of my favorite things.
Yes, absolutely. So Sharon does write for young children all the way up through adult, but today we're going to focus the conversation on writing in the KidLit space. And so we're going to maybe start with the youngest readers. Well, maybe not the super youngest readers, because that would be board books. But we're going to start with picture books. And Sharon herself has written a picture book. So she is a picture book author. But you know, that picture book space, language is just such an important component of those books. Can you tell us why exactly it's so important to make sure that the language is just top-notch at the picture book level?
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons. One is that you want, as always, to engage the reader, right? You really want to engage the reader, have them interested and excited to hear the story, but also because parents end up doing a lot of the reading in picture books, and that becomes very repetitive. So you want the language to be something that they enjoy. The story should be something that they can enjoy reading over and over and over as well. So there are those are the couple of reasons why it's so important.
Yeah, it would be terrible if I had to read to my kids, Jane went to the store. Jane picked up bananas. Jane walked from the store. Like that's kind of more the language we might expect in some early readers or things that are teaching children how to read. But in a picture book, as you mentioned, we really want to draw the audience in. And can you speak maybe a little bit to the read aloud factor of picture books?
Well, again, parents are reading these books often aloud to kids. And so you don't want them to stumble. You want them to you want to make it so it's a smooth read. It's an enjoyable read. There's rhythm to it. There's movement in the words. And that's not just because of the parents reading it aloud, but because the way the story needs to flow. Again, that rhythm and that movement and the sounds that you use in a picture book, your word choices are really critical. Word choices are what drive the way that the story feels. It's the voice of the story. So you'll see with most bedtime books, like lullaby books, you'll see softer word choices and sibilants and smoother sounding rhythm, and it's a slower pace. You want the pace to be consistent with a book that will help lull a child to sleep. You don't really want a book that gets them climbing the walls, bouncing all over, jumping up and down because they're so excited. Woo, what's happening in the story at bedtime? So again, the type of picture book matters in what kinds of word choices that you're using, and the pacing and the rhythm and the sound of it.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I mean, I suppose we could even talk about the length of a picture book. When you only have a few hundred words to work with, everyone carries that much more weight, right? For the entire story. You can't just throw away extra words like you might be able to in something that's longer.
Yeah, it's true. So now 500 words or less, 400 words or
Yeah.
less,
Yeah.
lots and lots of practically or completely wordless picture books are out there now. It's, which is fascinating to me. I love some of those. Some of those are fabulous because, but usually those are very illustrator heavy,
Yep.
illustration heavy. But yeah, if you're looking for a resource for the auditory experience or the voice and word choices, Darcy Pattison used to do a blog called Voice Friday. I don't know, you could still pull it up if you go look at it. And Word Sounds is one of those Voice Friday posts that she did. She also did one a long time ago that I wasn't able to pull up and find very quickly. That was specific to getting deeper into what types of words and where to use them with
Yeah.
your, and again, with the lullaby being the softer, and with your, when you're trying to excite someone, you're using more hard consonants and, and shorter, snappier words, and getting that pacing up and just, getting that excitement in there because the pacing matters. Everything matters. Everything matters in all your writing.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but a picture book, because it's so concise and so contained, it matters more
Yeah.
in, it's like taking something and squishing it down to the point where there's that extra pressure on it.
Yeah. 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 I like that visualization on that. So let's maybe move up a little bit now. So we move on. We're gonna skip over the early reader chapter book markets, just because those do tend to be more for developing a child's reading skills, and those are important, and language is important in an entirely different way than what we're talking about. But let's bump up here to middle grade. And in middle grade, I know that, at least according to the agents and editors who seem to be talking about it a lot, that middle grade voice can really be a challenge. And that is one of the things that is most frequently discussed as a barrier to writing middle grade, is that adult writers kind of have trouble tapping into that voice without sounding like too young or too old. So I don't know. Can you speak to us a bit about how writers can work within that middle grade space at a language level?
Well, it's not, yeah, like you said, it's a hard thing to do if you're not able to get inside your character. But if you can get inside your character and like sort of revisit who you were at that age, makes it a lot easier. Or if you never grew up like me, it makes it super easy, right? So to fall back into that space and to really get that character in your brain. But I want to, one of the things I always want to be cognizant of when I talk about this is, don't talk down to your readers at whatever age you don't want to talk down to your readers. Now, that doesn't mean that you can put every large word in your vocabulary in a middle grade book. You can put some in there, but it's important in the language of the book to make sure that you're using it in a context that makes it clear what you mean if you're using a word that may not be grade level specific to that grade. Now, you can go out on the web and you can look up words for that they're studying at certain grade levels, and that can be very helpful. You can go do your course standards and things like that. But if you know a word may not be familiar to your readership, you want to use it in a way that explains it. Even if you just have dialogue where a reader goes, well, that means blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's fine, but you don't want to do that over and over and over, right?
Right.
Because readers will start to realize, oh, you're telling me that you don't think I know that word. And some of your readers will know those words, right? So you want to be
Right.
careful about the word choices that you use and how you use them in middle grade. And the language that you use should be specific to what you're talking about. And again, for me, it's a little hard for me to think of another way to do it except for to get inside that character, get that character in your brain, get to know them. I have a course that I am working on that's all about knowing your characters. And I think that you really need to know your characters to know how they talk and how they think, because voice in middle grade is super important.
Yeah.
It's important in anything, but in middle grade especially, because kids want to hear kids their age hanging out.
Mhm.
They want to hang out with characters who are, their age or a little older and that they could relate to. You want it to be relatable.
Yeah, and there's nothing worse, at least I think there's nothing worse, than reading a book written for children that you can tell an adult thought children needed to hear this book or to read this book.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Especially
Right.
the didacticism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is a lesson book, but I'm gonna tell a story around it so you think it's not a lesson book.
Yeah.
There was a time and a place when children's books were all about things like Miss Manners and,
Yeah.
etiquette and how to behave and things like that. Those days are long gone. Kids want to read and see themselves reflected in books. They want characters they can hang out with. It goes back to my whole analogy about if you're going on a road trip, who do you want to get in the car with and hang out with?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you are not familiar with kids' voices, and I know this is going to sound creepy, but find a way to volunteer or get around kids that age.
Right.
Not just don't go and hang out in the park. That's creepy.
Yes.
But, maybe volunteer at a school and kind of start to hear what the kids are saying, or an after school program is a great place to hang out with kids. And in fact, if you're a writer, you can probably find a local place to volunteer to either teach writing and or reading to kids.
Yeah.
And that is a great opportunity to interact and to hear them interact with one another and get that voice in your head if you don't have the ability to just drop into that character. But again, knowing your characters is primary. It's key.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So then we go from our tweens, we'll call them the tweens, in our middle grade, and then we start shifting into YA, and now our stories are getting more complex, and certainly the vocabulary and comprehension of the reader has grown, so we can be more complex and perhaps more creative even in how, well, it's a different kind of creativity. I think it's almost more creative sometimes to boil things down simply, but we can add more complexity to our stories. So within the YA though, YA has its own distinct voice. So we got a very distinct middle grade voice, and then we have a very distinct YA voice. And I would say if you're not sure of what those are, just read a few of them and it will become clear. But how might a writer improve their writing once they are, going into this older teenage market?
Well, again, you're looking for a very specific voice through a specific character lens, and that's key. But also, to what you said, adding that complexity and layering in additional things. So when you're in a picture book, you usually have one thematic topic that you're talking about. When you're in a middle grade, you can add a couple of other nuances to that. You can add maybe a subplot to compare or contrast with. When you get into your YA, you can add multiple layers and your reader's brain can follow all of those various tracks. You can have more than one main character. There are a lot of ways that you can, that you get to change up the game, right?
Yeah.
To engage your young adult readers. For me, again, it's about channeling the voice of the character and using the kind of language that they would use. Now, a caveat to that is that you don't want to use slang that is current in a book that may not be published for 3 to 5 years, because that slang is going to change. What is skibbity toilet? I don't even know. I had to look it up. But, that's a middle grade thing, not a YA thing, but it's something that, right, go look it up.
Right.
It's
Right.
weird. But the thing is that that's a big thing right now. And you hear that from kids, but that's a thing that's going to go away. That's a trendy thing. So language has trends that it follows, and you want to be careful that you don't make your voice or your character speak too much in current slang, because 5 years from now, 10 years from now, hopefully your book is still out there. Young people are still reading it and they're going to be like, what?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, to counter that, since most of us writing in this space now would be adults, and some of us may have been a teenager decades ago at this point, you also want to be careful not to use the slang that you would have used as a teenager, unless you are writing historical fiction, which is a sad reality. Most of us now, if we are writing about our teenage years, would be considered historical fiction. But, I don't want to say, well, gee, she's groovy, because it's like,
Right.
I've dated it in another way.
Unless you have a character whose
Yes.
parents are, those people and never came out of that era and they grew up in that, then maybe you have a character who talks like that, but you need to point it out and what that means. And your other characters need to be like, oh, that's right. Frank is, or Flower, maybe we call the character Flower, talks funny, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. But yeah, you want to be careful of how you apply those sorts of things that change. And even the word cool or the word sick or
yeah, I know they all get different connotations to them now.
They
too.
morph over time, and it becomes it. So you want to be careful how you use your language. But you don't have to do all that. You can just use basic language, but give your characters a different voice. So one character may speak in full sentences and another character may speak in single word sentences, like be very non-communicative, or you might have a character who only speaks in partial phrases and, and things like that, or even thinks that way. Give them and that's another thing. The interiority is very different for YA. You're giving us a lot more access usually into the interiority of the character, because they are, not that middle graders aren't thinking about where they fit in the world, but I think when you're a teenager, you start to get super inside yourself and super concerned about what's going on. How do I fit in this new world? How do I become who I need to be? And they're worried about so many things these days. And not that we all weren't, because that's when the brain rewires. So when you become a teenager is when your brain is doing all sorts of really interesting rewiring and stuff, and it's very, very active, and your synapses are firing in very odd and different ways, and they get very involved in themselves, a lot of teenagers. So they're very thinking in, so you can give them a lot more interiority and a lot more of those kinds of concerns.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of writers, when we think about beautiful writing, no matter what age group we're talking about here, I think a lot of writers probably have this perception of, well, we would call it the purple prose, but I have to have these gushing sentences about the sunsets and about the cuisine I'm eating, and really over the top in terms of descriptions and all of this. And I'm not sure that flies in the KidLit market, but do you have any advice for some writers who maybe want to add a little pretty prose, I'll call it pretty prose, to their writing without going over the top? Because I think we can both agree that if I have paragraph upon paragraph of description, a young reader is just checking out. So might you offer some suggestions here for writers who want to add a little, but not too much?
Yeah, so be specific about what the tonality and the mood and the feel of the words that you use. So you don't have to have 3 sentences to beautify the setting or the scene. One sentence will do, and one adjective will do if it's the right adjective and the right sentence. You can still be fairly concise and still have beautiful writing. And I mean, you and I know that my background is in poetry. And so it comes from a poetic background, that to be very concise and yet use imagery that really resonates and sets the scene and gives you a certain mood and tonality. You can do the same thing in your prose. It's all about finding just the right nuanced word.
Mhm.
So I say when you're drafting, he can walk into a room, he can look out the window, he can see the bright sun, he can, your character can do all the things. But when you're revising, your character should stride into the room or slouch into the room or creep into the room. Or, there are so many choices for even your verbs, your action words, that there's so much glorious stuff out there in the language that you can use, and really by that one word change the whole mood or tone, or set the whole mood or tone. I talk about this a lot when we talk about character lens with my clients. I talk about seeing the world through the lens of your character, through the eyes of your
Yeah.
character. Focus on one or two things that they would see in the setting, and then filter that through their emotion at the moment. What are they feeling? Is the sunshine mocking them, or is it making them super happy because they're already in a happy mood? Like, are they in a bad mood and, it's all bright outside? Yeah, I don't want to go out there. It's too bright. Like, what is their emotional uh, feeling right at that time? So what are the one or two things that they would be looking at that they might notice in their environment, and then pick the most perfect nuanced word for that? That's all done in revision, though. I
Yeah.
don't think you should focus on that once you start learning it and once you start doing it in revision, a lot of that will become organic as you draft. So the next book you write, your draft will have more of that in it already, and the next book after that, and the next book after that. But don't worry about it when you're first drafting. You can use your basic placeholder words, but remember that words like walk or walked are all placeholder words. Cliches, you can put all the cliches you want in your first draft, but once you've go in to revise, find those cliches and then rewrite them through your character lens. Give it something new, instead of they tied a bow around it, they put sequins and glitter on it, if that's who your character is, right? It's all done through character lens,
Yeah.
and that nuance of the English language is huge. It's got so much glorious stuff in it.
Yeah.
Use your
Yeah.
words.
Well, and to your point with the comments about how it's being filtered through the character, we don't have to mention everything. I don't have to describe everything. I only need to describe what's important to reflect in my character in the story at that time.
Yeah, and the pacing matters too. So
Right.
if you're in a slow, I go back to my car analogy all the time. I go back to the road trip analogy. If you're speeding by in a car, what one or two things are you going to see out the window?
Right.
Right. So when the pacing is up, what things are you going to see? Right. If you're cruising slowly down the road, you might see more things. You might actually give us three things instead of one. Yeah, because
Yeah.
you're slowing the pacing down, the character is moving more slowly through the world. So that will help us also with pacing. I mean, language and at the line level, I love line level stuff. I love doing revision at the line level,
Yeah.
because especially because I work with speculative fiction writers, and the world building is just offers so much glorious opportunity for making fresh cliches and fresh ways of saying thing. And it's just so much fun to me to be able,
Yeah.
and making up, like, when I wrote my middle grade Lost and Found, I had so much fun making up the curses that the characters used, like rusty cogs and, things like that, because, broken springs, I just had
Right.
fun with it because it was part of the world and it was part of who they were. It's how they spoke in that world. So for those of you who are writing fantasy, speculative fiction, science fiction, use your words and use them based on the world that you're in. And it will go so much farther in building your world without you having to describe the whole setting all the time to us. Just giving them language that's specific to their world is going to help build that world.
Yeah. Well, you've talked about how writers can build this muscle just by the sheer fact of writing more practice, whether it's through revision or drafting. You and I are both big fans of reading, reading for the sake of learning from books as mentor text. How might people use their reading to help develop their line level writing skills?
That's a really great question. I believe that two things about mentor texts. One,
Yeah.
every book is a mentor text, even if it's a mentor text of what not to do.
Okay, fair enough.
And two, don't be afraid to read broadly and read widely and read outside of your genre and get the flavors of all the things and how people do that. Read a mystery and find out how they're using their word choices and and the nuanced choices that they make for the mood and tonality of that. Read a humorous book to see how they pull off a joke inside a book by using language and the setup and all of that.
Yeah.
Read across genres, read broadly, read across ages, and find out how other writers are doing it. This goes back to the analogy that I like to use about if you were learning to paint, you would study the masters and you would study their brush strokes and their use of color and their use of light and the way they set things
Yeah.
up on the canvas, what they choose to illustrate and what they don't. That's what you want to do when you're using a mentor text. So if you are reading a book and you're like, oh, this is terrible, don't do that. If you don't like the way a writer wrote something, then that's a mentor text for you for how not to write.
Right.
Don't do that. But if you're reading a book, and even if you're reading for pleasure and you find yourself just sinking into it, and all of a sudden you're in backstory and you go, how did they do that? I didn't realize we jumped and I was right there and it was smooth and it didn't bother me, right? How did they do that? Go back and reread those passages. Same thing with word choices. Look at the word choices that they're using to set the tone, the setting, the mood, the emotion. What dialogue words are they using for the language? And yes, always read in your age level. If you're writing middle grade, yes, you should read many more middle grade books than you are other things, but don't be afraid to go out and use what's out there where people have written all these glorious books and learn from them and apply what they're doing into your book, even
Yeah.
though it might be for a different age group.
Yeah. And I also like to, if I come across something that's particularly well written, just like a sentence or two, I don't do this at like a chapter level, but if there's something particularly well written, I'll like to write it in a notebook or something just to kind of keep it
I collect those
for
too.
later and kind of come
I
back and
do.
look to it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I collect those too. And as a matter of fact, I have for certain of my clients, I have a weekly news
Mhm.
uh, update that goes out to specific clients to keep them writing and to keep them encouraged. And every single one of those has one of those quotes that I have
Yeah.
recently found that I can apply to, you know, what I'm talking about that week to them.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
They're my cheer letters,
Yeah.
and then how did you apply this in your world, or did you find anything that did this in your world based on the quote that I'm pulling? Yeah.
Yep.
Pull
Love
quotes.
it.
I love pull quotes for all sorts of things like that. I put them in. Sometimes I'll use that as a jumping off place to write a blog because
Right.
something hits me as so glorious. I
Hmm.
I just wrote a blog post about if I were a dog, what kind of dog would I be? Because Seth Godin had that question in his newsletter. And I was like, that it really made me think about it. Right. So you
Yep.
never know where you're going to find the inspiration and the quotes that you can keep around you to help you write beautiful language. And don't be afraid to read good poetry
Right. Yeah. It
because
doesn't, I think people get intimidated by the idea of reading poetry, but we need not be.
there's so much glorious imagery in
Yeah.
poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to make sure to let everyone know that you have a really great resource on sensory detail, which obviously is very helpful for line level writing. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm actually updating that resource right now
Mhm.
because that one doesn't have there are two things that I've been always, that have been something I felt, but didn't know how to articulate until I was doing my residency this last year. And that is proprioception and interoception.
Mm.
And those are sensory components that are about where we are in space. That's proprioception, knowing where you are in space. Like dancers have to know
Yeah.
exactly where they
Yeah.
are, where their body is, where they are in space. And interoception is that those weird feelings that you get, and all of the gurgling and all of the things that are happening inside you as well. And another concept that I want to incorporate into that is something I learned this last year called Umwelt.
Hmm.
Umwelt is the specific environment of an organism. And every organism has a specific environment.
Yeah.
And how we sense our environment is different than, say, a dog senses their environment, or a jellyfish senses their environment, or an electric eel senses their environment. I learned this from a book called, I can't think of the name of it. This
That's okay.
immersive world. I'll give it to you to put in the notes.
Sure.
I'll look it up. But the idea being that if you're an earthworm, so this is why it comes back to sensory. If you're an earthworm, if you don't have a perception of how you affect the environment versus how the environment affects you, then you would never be able to dig a hole, because every time you pushed against the dirt, you would feel like the dirt was pushing against you and you would
Oh,
back up. So that perception of your environment and how you're affecting the environment and how it's affecting you is really important. And it just, okay, I'm nerding out. I'm totally nerding out. I know it. But this whole idea of how we affect our environment and how versus how the environment affects us, I think is just fabulous. And I'm looking at ways to articulate that for writers
yep.
to be able to add that to their toolbox.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm always happy to nerd out. I mean, you know that you won't find a much more nerdy person than I am. So it's totally cool. But I do want to thank you for your time and for digging into this stuff with me. The line level, I think it's so, I'm glad that you talked about it being more of a revision thing. I think sometimes writers get worried that their first draft sounds terrible and that they're not a real writer because they can't write pretty sentences, but we know that a lot of that happens later in the process. So I hope that this conversation has helped to encourage people in that way. Yeah.
Well,
so I
last
want
night,
to thank you.
yeah, last night I worked on my work in progress, and all those words sounded pretty terrible, but it moved the story along, and I can go back and revise them later. So I'm good. I'm good with that.
She's like, I'm fine. I'm fine. It's all good. It's all good. So thank you so much, Sharon. And thank you, writers. And we will catch you next time.
Thanks
Bye.
for having me. Right on.